And we are back. I hope everybody had a good little break there and you were able to kind of ruminate on our presentations that were excellent and full of great information. And maybe we'll just start diving into these questions and get the ball rolling with that. And again, please put your questions in the Q&A and not the chat. Questions posed in the chat will not be addressed by the panelists or moderators. However, if you're having a discussion with someone that you know in the chat and they may have the answer, that is fine. But questions addressed at panelists will not be addressed in the chat. First question we have here is to Helen. What innovations are likely to come out of current research to reduce phosphorus runoff, or in other words, eutrophication mitigation? Are there tillage practice changes, additive in phosphates like chelate complexes or nanoparticulation? What, in your opinion, will resolve until 2030?
That's a great question, and I really like that until 2030, or the sort of framing of what do we want now to inform decisions in the future. I think in terms of managing eutrophication and phosphorus, it's always a really place-based thing. So one of the things we need is not actually always more science, it's how to interpret that science in the lens of your landscape. So some of the questions came up around cover crops. In erosional landscapes, those are going to be really great. In our landscapes that tend to be flat, sometimes they're not as good. But we really need that capacity to take the science we have and translate it on the landscape for decision making. I see some of the sort of easier wins around, retirement of marginal lands, place-based phosphorus management. There's such incredible potential coming there and there already. And even as it relates to, our understanding of hydrology of the system, where water moves, there's a lot of benefit there. And then that question around just what is the right rate? Those are sort of some of my initial areas, but there's a fantastic toolbox of solutions, and we need to figure out how to fit that in the landscape and how that fits with agronomic goals as well.
Excellent, thank you. We have one that this is maybe perhaps vague and it is directed at everybody. Ruth Knight says, I hear comments about social license to farm in regards to land management. What does this really mean? And where does it fit in the balance of guiding land management adaptations? So, I mean, of course, it's the ongoing and ever evolving acceptance of industry standards, but could we read into that a little more, and where do we see that going, and perhaps the balance in between, productivity and land and soil health?
I'll start, and then I'm going to throw
to
you really quickly, Ryan. I think, social license relates to that public acceptability. So that's one pressure that producers see and feel. And, we see critical articles in the Western Producers, and then, flipping back and forth in terms of criticisms and support of different management decisions. And they're always going to be complicated. I think what we see is polarization on some issues, which is a huge issue. And producers, I think, really feel that quite deeply in terms of when issues become really fractious. But in terms of what it means to change in the landscape, it's pretty complicated. And I think others listening and here will know more about, what motivates producer decision making. That's part of it. But other things are leadership and seeing, people you respect making changes and following those. So it's sort of a complex bunch of factors. Ryan?
I don't know if I can really add to that. You guys both did a real good job. I mean, let me think about that one for a second.
Well, no, I'll pick it up then. From a water perspective, it's huge. Here in the region, there are a lot of people that say, farmers, they all use our water, right? And we're losing it, we're never getting it back. Yes, that part of that water is used for an economic activity. You make money by growing a fantastic crop, which might take away from the benefit that someone downstream may have had from kayaking in a river with a higher water level, whatever. something like that. So it's really about understanding what does this bring to the region. Irrigation districts would like to frame it as well. We're offering opportunities for recreation. We also offer opportunities for ecology, though that's a bit of a, well, it's an argument, but it's not a very strong one, I would say. But recreation is for sure is a thing. We don't have that many lakes, but we do because we have reservoirs. It also works the other way around. If, let's say, if we enter a drought and producers will irrigate less because they don't have as much access to water. Should residents in Calgary or in Lethbridge water their lawns, yes or no? Technically, yes, because it really doesn't make a difference for any irrigator. But whatever we put out here is a literal drop in the bucket. In order to create a less polarizing environment, we should probably say, okay, we're going to use less as well. It will benefit us because we might not have access to our normal license or our normal amount of water, but it just helps the optics, right? So if producers show and are able to get the message across that they really value water and they do try to make good choices to use it wisely and not just let it walk or run down the drain, then that transfers into a better understanding. But it requires that people meet each other and talk to each other and are willing to listen to each other as well.
Do you have anything to add to that, Ryan?
I've been thinking about it here, and I'm like, how it's. I understand the concept of social license, and I don't know if it is really having an impact on agriculture the way I see it. We're still doing a lot of unsustainable practices, and it's not like the consumer can boycott the product that we're producing. It's food. Like I read in the paper 3 weeks ago about the chemicals again found in wheat and oat, Cheerios, and that. Like those messages keep getting through slowly, but I don't see them changing land use or land management. We're out my window.
Okay. Question here for Dr. Balch and Ryan, you could speak to this as well. Could you please elaborate a bit on the trade-offs between water quality in the context of runoff and the application of nature-based solutions?
Yeah, and there I was trying to flag all of the impacts we have really do have trade-offs. So, when Ryan was talking, seeing the efforts at wetland conservation, super, super useful. When we're trying to restore wetlands, we often see lags where they release phosphorus for 5 or 10 years before we get those ecosystem services back. So that's a short-term trade-off. And then some of the other ones can be around, cover crops in certain landscapes can be negative for water quality, reduced tillage, certainly we see that impact here, and so on. So it doesn't mean we shouldn't pursue those activities. It just means as we think about, it's a really, all of the BMPs we're thinking about, all of the nature-based solutions have multifactorial effects in the landscape, and those effects are different, one wetland to the next or adjacent to a stream versus in a more upland area and so on. So it's really just trying to figure out how to put all of those pieces on the landscape in the best way to achieve all of the goals we have environmentally and agronomically. And it's certainly complicated, but I want to keep it as part of the conversation is what are all of those trade-offs that we're going to be managing?
Can you speak to that at all, Ryan? The question about,
Yeah.
nature-based
I mean,
solutions.
I've heard this before. I remember Dr. Don Flayton flagged this out of the Tobacco Creek model watershed too, that, certain practices that seem beneficial in one area contribute to phosphorus leaching and loading in another area. And I don't know. As Helen talked, I'm like, okay, how are we going to solve this problem? Like, let's limit runoff. Let's try to do that. Like, let's maybe address some of these, either the easier sides of that equation or look at other, try to reduce phosphorus loading from other maybe easier means. I wouldn't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, to speak, in the sense that there is seemingly a lot of benefit that comes from reduced tillage and cover cropping and stuff like that. So let's maybe look at the other phosphorus reducing strategies first. It's kind of a cop out, but
I 100% agreement. Those are practices we need that are here to stay. So it's sort of, are there small tweaks to those that'll help? And then what are the other things that we should be doing? It's sort of like, all of the nutritional advice about a balanced diet. It's like a balanced diet of BMPs of, these ones are really great for this area, but maybe we should have this on our plate too, just to keep water quality issues in balance.
Totally. It's so contextual and about like layering mitigation strategies that complement one another and maybe have an additive effect. And it's not a zero sum, if you are or aren't doing this practice, you're a good or bad producer, right?
Exactly.
There's a question here, and I'm just maybe going to try to get to the crux of what they're getting at, but I completely, I think I understand what they're saying. So this would be for Willemin. I think in your presentation, you mentioned a policy when it comes to access to water. Was it first in line, first in line? Was that what you called it? And then, so the question is in relation to, or in the context of Indigenous peoples, are there any accommodations there for Indigenous peoples for access to water?
Excellent question. There should have been, right? First in time, first in right is the official title. But that doesn't mean that if you were first here, you have your first place in line. It is if you have a number on your water license. So when the first water licenses were given out, First Nations were not recognized as having a right to access water or maybe even a need to access water. So they were completely skipped over. In, I would say, the recent decades, there have been efforts to make sure that First Nations would get licenses. But due to the characteristics of the system, that would mean that they would get junior licenses. So still others would come first before they would be able to get their share. 2 governments ago, there's been some actual work. So negotiations to set up a water agreement outside of the FITFER system. And that has led to at least 2 large First Nations to get a good chunk of water, or access to a good chunk of water, with an official agreement with the province that will put them outside of the FITFER system, but that means that they can use that water for whatever their purposes are. So the Kainai Nation, part of the Blackfoot Confederacy, right west of Lethbridge, they have the largest private water license, essentially here. And they also have a thriving forage business, Timothy processing plant. So they are quite large irrigators, actually.
Excellent. It's nice to see, things happening in the spirit of reconciliation and recognition of Indigenous peoples. Sorry, did I hear somebody? No.
Well,
okay.
It's going too slow, but
of course. Yeah.
There was some movement for a while.
Yeah. Okay. Comment in the question here. Excellent presentation, Helen. It's evident that phosphorus poses a significant environmental challenge, particularly in Manitoba's water systems. However, Manitoba has adopted a unique strategy since 2011 by focusing not only on reducing phosphorus, but also on nitrogen from waste treatment plants. This approach contrasts with the practices in other provinces, where the emphasis tends to be solely on phosphorus reduction. Could you please elaborate on the rationale behind Manitoba's decision to address both phosphorus and nitrogen, and how this approach aligns with or diverges from the strategies employed by other Canadian provinces?
Yeah, so first I'll start by saying I didn't know as a limnologist I'd need training in political science. This is another highly political decision that was made. So the key thing is that phosphorus is considered the ultimate limiting nutrient. So if we can manage that, we can bring the baseline level of those blooms down quite considerably. So that reducing phosphorus is always going to be fundamental advice. And then there's this question about nitrogen laid on top of that. And from an agricultural perspective, the advice is always manage it as well as you can. There's lots of sustainability benefits, even outside of any water quality issues. In terms of managing it in wastewater, it gets a whole lot more complicated because it's incredibly expensive, as any Winnipegger knows. So what does it mean when we decide to manage nitrogen in wastewater? It means a lot of money, and then it means some complicated effects downstream. Nitrogen has a role in toxicity of algal blooms, but that role is really complicated. It depends on the toxin we're talking about and who's blooming. So it may increase the risk of toxicity, but I think the science is still unsettled on that one. And then it also affects the chemistry of sediments in ways that affect phosphorus loading, and iron cycling, and affect the blooms again. So reducing ammonia can be a big benefit, but reducing nitrate could actually lead to some increased phosphorus loading in the lake itself. So as we sort of diverge into a limnology lecture rather than an ag talk, what I'd say is that's a really complicated decision. It was certainly hotly contested, and it's hotly contested in my area of work. Is it the right decision or not? I think the jury's out. The Regina wastewater treatment plant also has nitrogen removal, and nitrogen removal is becoming a lot more common in sewage. I think the jury's still out, and I'm going to keep a close eye on that one in terms of whether it's worth it economically, or whether we'd be better to throw all that money at phosphorus removal and then some of those complicated ecosystem level effects that we might anticipate.
Excellent. Thank you for that answer. This is a question for Ryan. Can you explain why people might encourage millet and veg as a cover crop? Aren't those plants somewhat aggressive, aka produce a ton of seeds and are hard to control? My family is constantly battling millet on their grain farm, so probably a good time to talk about the different varieties of millet and their uses.
Yeah. I don't know if people are encouraging others to grow. I know that I've never honestly heard negative comments around millet or vetch here. I know vetch is a fairly popular, more so probably than the millet. Vetch is a popular plant to grow because it's valuable for seed production. They can make a lot of money on the seed, and then it also works well in a grazing context. A lot of guys will put it in with corn, do corn grazing. It'll stay green into the winter and all that kind of stuff. So I'm not totally, like I say, I've never really actually heard negative comments around millet. Another comment I'll make is I think we're pretty new into the cover crop experimentation stuff in my part of the world. I'd say within the last 5-10 years. So I think the diversity piece is quite important. They want to see a mix of warm and cold season plants, forbs and legumes and grasses. So I think we're still a bit of an exploratory phase of cover crop use in my part of the world. But yeah, I'm sorry, I can't speak to the negativities of millet really.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, we farm south of you, and millet really likes our sandy soil and it likes our hot weather, and the grasshoppers tend to stay away from it. And again, we're using golden German millet, so that's a millet that doesn't make the little seeds, and we tend to see that the geese and the waterfowl, we're in a very big migratory bird area, aren't as attracted to it as, say, like a proso millet. So that would be why we use it on our operation, to give a little bit of background. But let's see what we have here. Oh, what this is from Kim Aminsky to Helen. From your perspective, what would it take for phosphorus recommendations to be updated?
Yeah, I saw this question and I started to think about it, and I think about it a fair bit. I mean, I think there's quite a few pieces to that. There's like the science piece, there's producer acceptability and economics. So, what are the agronomic costs of change, or what does that yield response look like? What does it look like in wet years versus dry years? So we can start to understand sort of, are we making recommendations that are great for wet years, and what, given we don't have a crystal ball, what do we do to manage those wet, dry cycles? is there an agronomic cost of change? How does that relate to an environmental benefit of change? And how do you handle that fact that there's different beneficiaries? But I think a key thing would be producer and industry acceptance. So one suggestion that I think is a really great one from Jane Elliott is maybe we need some really large scale strip cropping experiments where producers are paid to decrease P inputs on strips, and then we monitor yields and soil phosphorus and see what comes. And I think that would be a really nice way to start to pull together the science that we need, and also building that trust. So that's sort of the start of an answer, but it's certainly something I'd really love to, invest in some bigger conversations around.
There's a question that's here about phosphate and runoff, and I think a lot of the solutions are about addressing the runoff because of mobility in the soil. But this is saying there needs to be research on what can restrict phosphate within the root zone and trapped and enhance mobilization to root systems rather than runoff with water. It would be a plant biotech miracle.
Here.
What do we have here? Most runoff is sourced through rains and floods, flood intensity complex with climate change, or made more complex with climate change. What remediation or mitigation do you anticipate? It says here, tillage and cover crop is an old story that have people been observing from long. So I'm just trying to get to, can you also see the questions on your screens? Okay. Let's go. A question regarding the Canada Water Agency. Does anyone know how the Canada Water Agency will interface with agriculture? And does anybody that has awareness of that have any thoughts on how PFRA handled the interface?
That's a great question that maybe we need to bounce to the barley sandwich session. I know a little bit, mostly murmurs about CWA, but I think that's a great question. And really, will it bring some of the capacity back that PFRA was? What does that look like? How can we argue together for that? That'd be a really good one.
Absolutely. Let me see here what I've got for some juicy questions. Well, how big of an impact could technology have on irrigation water use? It's a pretty broad question.
I mean, hopefully 10%. So most of the time, as I said in the presentation as well, generally speaking, over the whole of the region, most farmers under irrigate. Just because you get busy and you don't get to it, or something breaks down and you miss one or two applications, and you've now suboptimally watered your crop, but you've gained your water use efficiency, most likely. The advantage would be that we get a better understanding of sort of where is the fine line that you could irrigate to, especially under drought conditions. The biggest strides in water savings and in water use efficiency increases were made by transitions from canals to pipelines, and then from flood irrigation and wheel move irrigation to low pressure center pivots. The low pressure center pivot is great. It works for a lot of people and for a lot of different landscapes. The next step would be to have everyone convert to drip or subsurface drip. Now that's less likely because it is trickier. It does involve plowing in a lot of plastic into your lands. It is definitely not for everyone. It doesn't pay off for every situation either. So it's we can get some gains for sure, but not the nice 20-30% reductions that we've seen since, let's say, the 70s to now.
Okay, and does anybody else have anything to add to technology impacting irrigation?
Or water management, I guess.
Or what? Yeah, or water management. Yeah, we can broaden it to include water management.
I can't resist. I mean, I think it's maybe less on technology, but I do think, it relates to the systems that you work on, Willemine, is questions of environmental flows and need to look at that flow of water across our provincial boundaries and how we're managing those flow allocations, for agriculture for different uses, but also start to build that decision making around the ecology of the systems a little bit more too.
Excellent. Ryan, have you noticed, how has the type of uptake of programming changed over the years within the watershed districts or yours specifically? Maybe you could speak maybe more broadly, but like have you noticed more increase in uptake of programming? I know the watersheds have had a really awesome windfall of money for programming, and that's been excellent for producers. So what have you seen on the landscape?
It depends on the program type. Like we've had huge interest in cover crops in 2003 and no 2002, and then virtually nothing in 2003. So it's been up and down in the cover crop area. Our small dams were pretty active in seeking those out, so we maintain a fairly high uptake of that. But it's kind of program specific. So if a new program comes out, it really drives interest. The Prairie Watershed Climate Program or the On-Farm Climate Action Fund. That's the rotational grazing cover crop and nitrogen management program. It's been out for 2 years. It's really ramped up interest in nitrogen management, BMPs, and it'll come to an end at the end of 2024. So I don't know if I can see a trend. I mean, I thought we thought that the shelter belt program would just about go by the wayside when the program was cut in 2012, and it didn't. We transferred more or less all the cost to the landowners, and it reduced by about 2/3 and then stayed there and kind of slowly worked its way back. And now again with the 2 billion tree program, it's like we had a banner year last year. We're struggling this year to achieve our 50-acre target. So it's up and down in so many categories. I couldn't say there's a general trend one way or the other. Regenerative agriculture has kind of slowly come along in the background, and the programming has almost adopted itself or shifted itself to support that. So the cover cropping and these things like that. So that's an interesting one that's kind of slowly burning over time.
Maybe just further to that, even, do you see a shift maybe in the future when producers have kind of like a lot of the programming is targeted at infrastructure, and that's excellent. But then do you see a point where producers have exhausted their use of infrastructure and, one more fence line isn't going to have an impact, or another watering system isn't going to have an impact? Do you see maybe a shift in the future to incentives for maintaining habitat or biodiversity or things like that rather than infrastructure where the outcome is already there as a consequence of how they're managing the land and they don't have to change anything? It's just, hey, I'm already doing this, and this is maybe geared at land conversion, addressing land conversion.
Yes, I mean, we've had that thought process too, where it's like you can only do so much with that shallow wetland incentive program. There's only so many out there. So when we get them all under contract, then what? So yes, I do see a shift to that, and we are slowly positioning ourselves with some of our funders that are quite comfortable with annual payments. Incentive payments, annual payments have really only been a thing for 4 or 5 years since the launch of the Alice program has always been there since about 2015, but it's been very small in our watershed. We're one of 2 watershed districts in the province that offer Alice funding at the moment. But then the GROW program, when it launched in 2019, 2020, it offered the opportunity to recognize practices with annual payments. So then that opened the door to that as well. So set asides, like you say, habitat, no go kind of we'll stay off that land and receive a payment for it. Those things are already starting to show up. Yeah.
So there's a lot of complexity in BMP decision making when it comes to water quality and producer decisions. How do we try to support these decisions? Maybe policy wise or extension wise?
Great question. I think, it's really interesting to see the capacity that obviously exists in some areas, some watershed groups. So it's a question of how do we build that capacity elsewhere and sort of build the bridges with scientists and practitioners to, what's working, what's not working, where are your science needs, where do we have science that might help you out, and how do we, manage that complexity? So I think the answer is, PFRA. And some of these organizations that really help bridge, some of these people who can help bridge with some of the time allocated. But I think as I think about water quality challenges and agricultural change, it's that capacity question of, people like Ryan active in the landscape who can support others in their decision making. How do we make more of that? Ryan, how do we make more of that?
Well, we just I mean, I moved from BC and I came to Manitoba and I thought, oh, BC is so far ahead of Manitoba. We had the Salmon River Roundtable. I was getting active in it. And then I came out to Manitoba and I thought, oh, these guys, they're lost. And now I almost feel the opposite. Like Manitoba, the watershed district program has been on fire and supported heavily through funding. So I think we're up and running. I don't know if you can improve on us in Manitoba, but when you look to Saskatchewan, you've got watershed associations, and I know a handful of those fellas. So do they need capacity building assistance? I don't know where that comes from. Leadership within, examples from without. I'm involved with an organization by the name of Assiniboine River Basin Initiative, and that was our hope when we launched that organization, was to collaborate and communicate and help like everybody pull, like elevate their game, and so that's kind of the point of that organization, is to be a basin wide, share your tricks and tips with each other organization. I think there's possibility there, but it takes a lot of funding. I think that it's hard to fail as a watershed district now with the amount of funding support that we have.
So
Not
maybe
true on the Saskatchewan side.
oh,
So that's great to hear.
You're gritting your teeth. We're so happy for you. Maybe delving further into that, what are the biggest barriers to adoption of programming or of BMPs?
Well,
Like
that's
when
assuming for one thing that there is programming.
certainly, yeah, absolutely.
And speaking from the poor west of this prairie consortium, extension and adoption programming at the moment is very, very poor. So there might be BMPs out there, but they are not offered consistently through institutions or through groups to a large group of varied producers.
Yeah, that's a great point. I, of course, as a Southwestern Manitoban, my brain just went right to programming available. So thank you for pointing out my bias.
Well,
Ryan?
it's interesting too in the context of, major irrigation development proposed here, right? So thinking about irrigation and capacity, Saskatchewan and Alberta working together would make a whole pile of sense in terms of learning, but you're saying, there just isn't the capacity, even though irrigation's been so active in Alberta for so long. And I think, again, there's been a lot of changes in Saskatchewan in terms of how those programs are administered. And I think we're in that state of flux, but it does seem like Manitoba has a lot of capacity. So we'll be on the phone soon.
A question here. Oh, this could go to barley sandwich too, because we could talk about this at length. But Bill Campbell's asking, with water management discussion, if surface water excess causes numerous issues with regards to soil erosion, leaching of phosphorus, and loss of crops, please discuss how tile drainage would work in certain regions.
Ooh, that's a big one. And I don't feel super qualified, so I'm gonna throw that to barley sandwich pretty quickly. I think one of the key questions is around the timing of when tiles are activated and how much benefit, whether they'd have benefit here. We see the impacts of tiles in places like Ontario are really complicated in terms of nitrogen versus phosphorus and benefits versus concerns. But here we would expect them to be very different. And there's certainly been some work in Manitoba on tiles, and I think there's more work coming out. But that's a practice that's expanding pretty quickly. And I don't know that we really have the science to understand what that means in terms of, you know, impacting runoff, impacting nutrient loads and benefits to producers.
It's had a lot of uptake in Manitoba. I don't think I drive a stretch of highway for any length of time without seeing a new field having tile drainage installed. And yeah, with the needing some evidence-based reasons for doing it in certain areas is certainly important, because I've seen a field that had a visible slope and it was tile drained, and I'm like, I don't understand. I'm not a hydrologist, but I don't understand why that needed to be tile drained. But yeah, what do I know? But yeah, Bill, we could definitely take that into the barley sandwich, because there's certainly some folks that'll be in there that would talk about tile drainage at length. I'm just trying to see what else. So we have some questions about the best places to access information about all of the funding opportunities for producers specifically. So I know you're not from Manitoba, Carrie, but I created a resource for Manitobans that I tried to just put a one-stop shop with links to all the different funding. But yeah, it does take a bit of a deep dive in Google. But if you start at the federal level, then you can get into the different cost shares generally. But yeah, I can, if you contact me, I can probably hook you up with a person in Quebec that would know a lot of the programming available. We're getting low on questions here. Yeah, similar for Alex's question about British Columbia funding. So I can potentially hook you up with some people I know in those areas. And again, there's more questions, another question to Ryan about projects and the history of funding sources for the watershed, but you did kind of speak to that. Gosh, I think we're running out of questions. Are there, oh, here's one. Sorry, Brian. The answer to your question. So, oh yeah, I'm so sorry. I didn't ask this. You're right. Thank you for re-asking. I missed it. My apologies. So this says, great presentation, Dr. Balch. With no-till and banded application, not only is there vertical stratification of phosphorus due to crop residue decomposition at the surface, but also horizontal variability due to not having tillage redistributing fertilizer bands. This complicates fertilizer recommendations because the average soil phosphorus of 15 centimeter deep sample is not what the plant root is seeing. Should we base recommendations on the old band, the surface 5 centimeter, or something else? 10 to 15 parts per million Olsen phosphorus may be ideal for the plant, but how do we know where in our soil to assess the phosphorus?
$1 million question right there. I mean, I think agronomically, I'm not the person to answer your question. Environmentally, certainly it's the top 5 centimeters that we would want to test. And I think the question becomes, should we be routinely adding that to all of our soil testing? And what types of decision structures can we provide around what you do when you see that stratification of it right in at the soil surface? What's the practice that we're going to recommend in that context? And I don't think I know we don't have that in Saskatchewan. I don't think we have that in the prairies, and certainly in other regions, it's an issue as well. So I do think, soil testing at 2 depths may be the way that we do need to move forward, which is money. And then what is the practice change we would advise at the end of the day? So I'm asking more questions in response to your question, but it's a good one.
Thank you for that. Ryan, do you ever open your farm to tours or show others your grazing?
Yeah, we were part of a summer grazing tour last year.
It was so
And I
hot
mean,
that day.
yeah, that was a hot day. If you show up at the right time, you can jump in the side by side with me anytime. Come out, move cows. Yeah.
Excellent. I think Rick, your question might be best also in the barley sandwich. So I encourage you to pop over there as soon as we're done here. Um, talking about, how PFRA may be regarded and perceptions of that. Yeah, I think we're covered. We do have 5 more minutes. And maybe I'll just sit tight and wait in case any other questions come in. But maybe I'll turn it over to our panelists and say, are there any questions that came from the question period or that you would like to address that you didn't get a chance in your, relatively short presentations?
I didn't even realize that subsurface drip irrigation existed until this summer. So maybe a question like, is that very common?
No, it's not very common, but it is possible. So even at the quarter section scale, you can
Really?
plow in lines. You're obviously not going to put one line at every plant row. So you have to manage your irrigation a little bit differently, especially during crop emergence. But it does have advantages, especially if you are in an area where you are more likely to receive less water. Some people, well, you irrigate more of your quarter section. Your center pivot will only cover 126 of your 160 acres. With the drip, you can potentially do the entire 160. It is a little bit easier to control and automate the system remotely. And you can do some additional perks, put in fertilizer, vertigate, etc. Though that brings a couple of environmental risks as well, and it's more expensive. If you start from scratch, so if you don't already have a center pivot on your land, then at the moment it is almost at the same ROI per acre as a center pivot would be. So it's still out there for the adventurous producer, but it's an option for sure.
Anything else in the final moments that you wished you had been asked or that kind of made you think and had have the wheels turning that you can answer quickly, or we could take it over to the barley sandwich session?
I think one thing I'll say is just looking at the images of different landscapes, the erosion, the big storms, and then the incredible drought afoot, at least in this part of the world. Grateful for some snow, at least here. Questions of adaptation and sort of what does it mean when, we're all thinking about slightly different pieces of the pie and then starting to act on them. So again, I think this is something to take us maybe to the barley sandwiches is we're on an adaptation journey and lots of agricultural change. So how do we support that? How do we support the conversations that are needed to really get there?
No more questions have popped into the Q&A. And so with that, I think I should so Roland has said in the chat, not in the Q&As, there will be a soils and livestock breakout in the barley sandwich session. So we can take a lot of this over there. And please join us in the barley sandwich session. If you would look over, I'll direct you over to the chat function and check out the link there. And we will see you in the barley sandwich. I would like to thank all our panelists today for the discussion. And of course, they'll be available in the barley sandwich session as well. So thank you for your dynamic presentations and engaging with all of us.